is your land.
He comes seeking adventure as the old pirates, eh?
Make the jump to light speed.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go!
Welcome to the Disneyland Beat, where our toes tap to a Disneyland drum.
And we always whistle while we work.
Hi, I'm Amy.
And I'm TC. If you've been going to Disneyland for several years, it doesn't take that long before you find yourself walking around the park telling your friends, you know, that thing there used to move, or that used to be part of a little ceremony, or this ride used to have more effects.
Sometimes things break and Disney producers decide they are too expensive to fix. Sometimes things present safety issues for guests or cast members. Sometimes things become less popular with time and they are discontinued. And sometimes it seems Disney just hopes you won't notice.
Disneyland has a number of abandoned props, street shows, and effects that operated for years that are still in the park in plain view in one way or another. Either they no longer work, or Disney chooses to no longer utilize them.
In Fantasyland, there is a fantastic photo op of the fabled Sword in the Stone. The sword Excalibur set through an anvil and into a large stone as seen in the classic Disney animated film. Hundreds of people pull on this sword each day as they get their picture taken.
But it used to do so much more. Guests who frequented the park prior to 2004 know that the sword can indeed move and used to be part of a fun show starring Merlin the Magician that began its run in 1983 with the reveal of the new Fantasyland.
Merlin would appear saying they needed a temporary ruler, a new king and queen for the day, but they needed to prove themselves by pulling the sword from the stone. He would typically call on a couple burly-looking adults to try, though they would inevitably fail.
Then, Merlin would call on a young child to try and dislodge the sword, and when they pulled, the sword would slowly raise up out of the anvil, not entirely, but pretty far, enough for the kid to feel super strong and to enjoy some Disney magic.
The show became a bit stale over time. It was shortened, then eventually phased out entirely, but we sure wish they would bring it back. Seeing Wart and Merlin in the Magic Happens parade makes us very nostalgic for this charming Fantasyland moment that worked so well with its surroundings.
On the other side of Fantasyland, tucked behind the It's a Small World Plaza and Edelweiss Snacks, is an odd little pier sticking out into a pond like a hidden harbor.
Today, it's one of the most peaceful havens in all of Disneyland, essentially a seating section. It's always shaded, there are always ducks to visit with, and it's the most peaceful spot to enjoy a seated, if only partial view of the fireworks.
But it does look odd, like it was built to provide dock access to the water with boats. And in fact, it was. This pier used to be the launch for Disneyland's motorboat cruise, a ride that operated here from 1957 until 1993, closing 30 years ago at this point.
When it first opened, boats cruised around a small waterway that went under Junior Autopia and Viewliner train bridges that eventually became the Autopia and monorail tracks.
The boats were attached to a hidden track under the water, much like the Storybook Land canal boats, and guests would pilot themselves around the loop.
In a misguided effort to keep the ride updated, in 1991 an overlay was added and it became Motorboat Cruise to Gummy Glen, themed to the Gummy Bears Disney Afternoon TV show. Remember that one?
The overlay was notoriously bad, with simple plywood painted cutouts placed around the banks, and the guest reaction was understandably negative. And in 1993, the ride closed for forever.
The waterway sat unused until 2007, when about 2/3 of the canals were drained and filled in with landscaping, making what is left in the area what we see today.
Over in front of Pixie Hollow today, there's a small pool and water feature with paths on each side. In recent years, this pool has sat quiet, and it's often heavily dyed blue, we think to hide all of the mechanics that are easily seen in its shallow depths.
But it used to be the home of a cute lighting and fountain show that would play in the evenings.
We don't know why Disneyland has discontinued this show. It looks like all of the lighting and fountain equipment is still in the water in plain sight, but it hasn't operated in at least 5 years. It might be one of Disneyland's most recent abandoned effects.
Over in Adventureland is an attraction that is somewhat famous for its abandoned effects, Indiana Jones Adventure Temple of the Forbidden Eye. Since it opened in 1995, a lot of effects have either been changed or entirely abandoned, but we are only going to focus on 3 of them.
In the incredibly designed queue, there's a spike room that used to have an interactive element to it. It seems Disneyland may have fully abandoned it at this point. As you pass through the spike room, there's a large hole in the ceiling where there was a large post. The hole is still there as of the making of this video, anyhow.
Pulling the pole used to activate the spikes in the room, which would slowly move down with a very loud rumble. At first, Disney stopped the movement, and pulling on the pole would just activate a sound. Then, the sound went away, and then the pole itself.
When your Jeep enters the first room of the ride, you see 3 doors, but you always head into the center one. However, did you know that the doors used to move?
The doors would swing left or right, so even though the track always went straight, it appeared as if you were in a huge rotating chamber of doors, and it really sold the idea that there are multiple chambers of Mara. As it is, the suspension of disbelief is stretched really thin, even with its incredible projection effects.
It used to be that when your Jeep reached the main chamber, you would see the massive statue of Mara, and a beam of green light would shoot out of its eye, colliding with the ceiling.
And when it did, you would see the effect, and a large amount of debris would fall out of the ceiling, crashing into the fog and fire below.
It was, in fact, ice. An ice machine was built into the ceiling mechanics, which would drop a metered amount of ice for each ride vehicle. It was a thrilling effect. Having the cause, in this case the beam of light, and the effect, the falling debris, it really sells the realism of the moment and helps tell the story.
The moment is still part of the ride, just without the debris falling. A sound effect has replaced it. The ice caused issues, not remaining the right frozen or liquid consistency as needed, and it was eventually cut. By now, the machine is probably rusted solid.
In Tomorrowland, there is possibly the most obvious example of abandoned Disneyland sitting in plain sight. It jumps out at you as you enter the land. The People Mover tracks. They create a ceiling for the main boulevard, and they wind through every building and over and around the Autopia green space.
Every guest notices these tracks and probably guesses at their former function. The People Mover, still a popular ride at Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom, operated at the park from 1967 until 1995.
The ride was converted into the thrill ride Rocket Rods, which used the same track and loading platform, which is still visible today. It even acts as a centerpiece for the entire land. The Rocket Rods closed in 2000, having unintentionally caused great damage to the ride's infrastructure, so much so that it became a safety hazard.
Disney elected to leave the tracks and not repair the ride for 23 years now. Most likely, the damage is significant enough that many of the buildings the People Mover used to pass through would have to be demolished and rebuilt in order to repair the People Mover tracks.
Above that centerpiece second-story loading platform, there's a large satellite dish. It's a fun link from space to Tomorrowland here on Earth. Today, the dish is creatively lit to give it a sense of movement. But in the past, it actually used to move.
The satellite dish would spin and various parabolic panels would fan open. It was very futuristic and added a lot of kinetic energy to the land.
Of course, a new visitor to Disney's Tomorrowland might see the existing signage for a Starcade and expect to find a futuristic space-themed arcade inside. And indeed, at one point you could. From 1977 until 2015, you could play games in this spot.
For a while there were even Wreck-It Ralph and Vanellope meet and greets at the Starcade, but today it's only used for auxiliary needs, most recently a Magic Key Passholder Lounge. But we wonder why the signage remains.
Pirates of the Caribbean has certainly changed a lot over the years, and for lots of different reasons. But there is one abandoned effect many of our viewers often lament the loss of.
As you left the burning city and headed into the prison and armory, the creaking, smoldering boards above your head used to actually move around, a bit up and down and a bit side to side. It gave the moment an even greater intensity.
It does seem like a fairly simple effect compared to the other ones the ride regularly pulls off, so we wonder why it hasn't operated for so many years.
Abandoned effects left in plain sight are not limited to older rides and attractions. Disney's latest achievement, Rise of the Resistance, has many expensive effects, and it seems one has already broken and is being ignored.
When the ride first opened, during what we think is the climax of the ride, when passing under the huge laser cannons during a massive space battle, the cannons would recoil and move with each shot, and the trackless vehicles would sort of dance around them. It let you know that this was not a safe spot to be during a space battle.
But within a year, the large cannon ceased moving, and it remains the same today. It's too early to say conclusively, but it seems Disney has no intention of fixing these, or they would have done so.
As you ride it today, the vehicles still dance around, but the guns don't move, and it doesn't really make any sense. Now you know why.
At Pirate's Lair on Tom Sawyer's Island, there are quite a few pieces of abandoned Disneyland to witness. One of the highlights of the attraction used to be Tom and Huck's treehouse. At one point, this artificial tree was the highest point at Disneyland, affording views beyond the park into the orange fields of Anaheim.
When the island opened, a spring magically bubbled up from underneath the tree, cascading down 3 streams, each going in different directions. The story was, it was struck by lightning, causing the water to well up, and you could climb up into the treehouse to explore and take in the amazing views.
Today, the views are harder to catch as access to the treehouse has been removed. You can still see the entrances into the hollow tree trunk and the old treehouse platform, but guests have not been able to climb up since 2017.
And in the past few years, the spring has run dry. Several of the stream beds now sit empty, collecting puddles of rainwater and leaves in them. It's kind of sad.
On the other end of the island is a cabin you can only view from a train or a river vessel. As you pass by today, you will see Mike Fink's Keelboat docked right outside and a pleasant country scene, a nice cabin where this Mike Fink lives.
For one, if you didn't know, Mike Fink was the king of the river, the Mississippi River, and good pals with Davy Crockett and Georgie Russell. And they were all major characters in Disneyland's early years and part of a wildly popular television special.
In fact, the Keelboats opening at Disneyland in 1955 were the same ones from the film Davy Crockett and the Keelboat Race, named the Gullywomper and the Bertha May. They carried guests around the rivers of America for many decades, offering an inside lower deck and seating up on top too.
The boats always looked a little top-heavy, and in 1997, one eventually capsized, sending a boatload of guests into the water. While there were no major injuries, it signaled the end of the Mike Fink Keelboats.
The cabin, too, has an abandoned effect. Originally, it was a cabin that had been raided and left burning, with flames leaping from its roof.
It was a neat effect. A perpetually burning building makes for very good theater. But the story was that a pioneer family had been attacked by an unfriendly indigenous tribe.
Disneyland has made a lot of changes to its representation of First Nations peoples, and changing the story of this scene was one of them. However, the flames could be seen as little as 7 years ago.
And folks, there are even more abandoned effects in plain sight at Disneyland. In our next video on this topic, we're going to cover the visible remnants of the Country Bear Jamboree, Monsanto's House of the Future, the Court of the Angels in New Orleans Square, Haunted Mansion Snow White and Jungle Cruise effects, and much, much more.
Thanks so much for joining us. Be sure to subscribe for more.
May the light in the firehouse window always shine brightly.
And may your dreams always come true.
See you real soon, Mouseketeers.
This big new addition to Disneyland is an ideal gathering place for organizations visiting the park. We're just in time for the big potato derby. They're off and running. Uh-oh, number 13 dropped his bit, and coming down the stretch is the winner by a potato's eyelash. In this contest, table manners are left at home.